Good Thursday morning to you, and welcome to American University's panel on climate justice, part of the School of International Services series titled SIS Global to Local. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Malini Ranganathan, and I use she, her pronouns. I'm an associate professor at the School of International Service and also interim faculty director of the Anti-Racist Research and Policy Center. This panel is co-sponsored by AU School of International Service, the Anti-Racist Research and Policy Center, and AU's Sustainability Office. Thank you to the co-sponsors, and thank you especially to Kate Arion, Assistant Director of Events at SIS. I would like to start by acknowledging that the AU campus sits on the traditional territory of the native Piscataway and Nacotchtank, or Anacostan peoples. Indigenous peoples everywhere face some of the most dire and disproportionate threats on account of climate change. Today, I am so humbled and excited to host this conversation on climate justice with four warriors of environmental justice and civil rights. I remember a time not so long ago when conversations on environmentalism were dominated by white professionals and professors. A turning of that tide has been a long time coming, and today's speakers are certainly part of that turning tide and have a long history in the movement. Before I introduce our superstars, a few logistics. The discussion will last for about 45 minutes with 15 minutes at the end for Q&A. If you would like to ask a question, please submit it through the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom window. Closed captioning is available to those who need it. Please click on the option at the bottom of your screens. We ask that no one record the session since we will be recording it, and the video will be available on SIS's YouTube channel as well as the Anti-Racism Center's website for later viewing and sharing. We are also live tweeting the event on our Twitter account at AU Anti-Racism CTR. So please join the social media conversation and please use the hashtag climate justice. I'd now like to introduce the panelists. Dr. Adrian Hollis is Senior Climate Justice and Health Scientist at the Union of Concerned Scientists. Welcome, Dr. Hollis. Ms. Jackie Patterson is the Senior Director of the Environmental and Climate Justice Program of the NAACP. Thank you so much for being here, Ms. Patterson. Ms. Vernice Miller-Travis is Executive Vice President for Environment and Sustainability of the Metropolitan Group, and she is also co-founder of We Act for Environmental Justice, founded in West Harlem in the late 1980s. It's a pleasure to have you here, Ms. Miller-Travis.
Thank you.
And finally, Ms. Rhonda Hamilton is a Ward 6 Advisory Neighborhood Commissioner. For those of you who aren't familiar with the District of Columbia's electoral system, commissioners are nonpartisan elected officials charged with increasing participation and representation of DC's residents in local governance. Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to be with us, Ms. Hamilton. So I'd like to open with a grounding question for all of our panelists. What does climate justice mean to you? And what is one anchoring concept or one accompanying idea that you find most helpful in explaining how you define climate justice? So if we could start with you, Dr. Hollis.
Thank you, Malini, and thank you to AU for the invitation. So the way I think of climate justice, and I like to explain it, is that the environment is, or environmental justice is a huge umbrella, if you could visualize that. And that climate justice is one of the spokes, as is immigration justice, criminal justice, things like that. And that all of these spokes are affected by structural racism. And so when we talk about climate justice, what we're talking about is the disproportionate effect on the changing climate on certain populations.
If we could move to you, Ms. Patterson, thank you.
Sure, thank you so much.
So yeah, so just picking up, definitely disproportionate impact and the systemic roots of disproportionate impact would be the one thing that I would point to. And we see that showing up in terms of the gendered disproportionate impact, certainly the racial disproportionate impact, the geographical disproportionate impact, and the ways that it is prioritized or not prioritized because of who's actually being most impacted, and therefore where it shows up in the kind of political priorities as a result. So that would be my
Mhm.
side. Thank you.
Thank you. And Ms. Miller-Travis, what to you is climate justice, and what do you find powerful in helping to define it?
I would certainly build upon the things that that Dr. Hollis and Ms. Patterson just said, and I guess what I would add is that the impacts of climate change are being borne most directly and disproportionately by brown and black people the world over, though those populations, wherever they are in the world, have contributed the least to the conditions that have created climate change. So climate justice is about trying to center and or even put in front those vulnerable populations so that whatever it is that we can do to stem the devastating impact of climate change, we would center and or put at the front of the line those folks who are disproportionately bearing the brunt of its disastrous impacts. In the United States, that would be lots of communities who, through a history of systemic racism and residential segregation, live in low-lying areas, not because they chose to live in low-lying areas, but because they were forced to live in low-lying areas. And so as we see sea level rise increase more and more in coastal areas and even inland areas, we know that those populations are bearing the brunt. And so placing those communities, those populations, be it in other parts of the world, be it here in North America, at the front of the conversation is what climate justice means to me, that we rethink how we envision how we're going to respond, what we're going to do, what kinds of investments we make, what kinds of programs and what kinds of steps we take to try and thwart the ever advancing impacts of climate change, that we would place those who are most vulnerable at the front. So, or at the center of that, of those efforts. And so that's what climate justice means to me.
Thank you. I think that really drives home the fact that climate injustice incorporates spatial, geographical, racial, economic inequities. And I would now like to turn it to Ms. Hamilton, thinking about the DC context and your work here. What does climate justice mean to you?
I just like to say I echo so many of the great comments that was said before me. Climate justice to me means that we address the environmental threats, issues, and concerns that have historically and continue to negatively impact communities, including those residents who are most vulnerable to climate change. So many of their voices are being diluted when it comes to environmental health. It also means not continuing to overlook the people who are most affected by these injustices, especially communities who are bearing the biggest burden for them and whose lives are being negatively impacted every single day. There's so many communities that are breathing in toxic air. They're living on brownfield sites. They're living beside industrial facilities, coal burning power plants. It's just horrible, the conditions that so many have to live in every day. And their health is just threatened every single day from just stepping outside of their doors. They're exposed to so many toxins. I agree that I think it's just super important to uplift and to empower these communities and to work directly with them to address these injustices that they're facing. Their concerns need to be at the front of all of the things that we're working on collectively.
Yes, thank you so much to all of you for starting us off and really emphasizing that those who have borne the least responsibility for climate change bear its greatest impact and therefore need to be most centered in any path forward for addressing climate injustices. And that leads me to think about each of your individual roles in the movement and the work that you've committed to trying to fight these injustices. Dr. Hollis, I remember hearing you speak at a Women in Environmental Leadership dinner last year. Imagine that when we were all in person listening, and Vernice was in conversation with you, and it was just so wonderful and soul affirming. It was put on by the Smithsonian Anacostia Museum, and I just was very inspired by your professional and life story. And so as someone who has been working at the intersection of health equity, climate science, and environmental justice, how do you see right now the racially disproportionate impacts of COVID as intersecting with climate injustices?
That's a great question. Thank you so much. First, I like to refer to the time you're describing is the before time, right? Before COVID. So we're in the now. And what COVID has done is really, I guess, unveiled what we already knew, right? I mean, structural racism, as I mentioned earlier, is the basis for all of this. And by basis, I mean, we're talking about the people that you've heard us all say are most disproportionately affected, right? So we talk about redlining, which has led to some of the health inequities, most of the health inequities that we were talking about, because people are put in areas where they don't have access to opportunities for generational wealth. They have, they don't have, what they have is generational poverty, and they don't have access to healthy foods. So you see some of those health disparities because people have a limited choice. And with COVID, what we saw is something that has been repeated in history. The fact that these communities are communities of color are considered to be essential workers. Most of the jobs are held by these communities. They're considered to be essential workers. So they already have health disparities, and now you're putting them out in the forefront so that they have the greatest risk of exposure to COVID. And when they do, they have the greatest risk of death from COVID, right? So what we see now is sort of people coming to the realization that structural racism is such a very important part of where we are, and of the 200,000 plus deaths that we've seen, all have a relationship with the historical way that people have been treated, that communities of color have been treated. And that includes our indigenous brothers and sisters.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Ms. Patterson, in my teaching, we review the history of civil rights and how that has been so foundational to the environmental justice movement. And you yourself have written and spoken about climate change, in fact, being a civil rights issue, which I think is just an incredibly powerful way of framing it. So could you explain to our audience what you mean by this exactly, and what you think the role of civil rights is in addressing climate injustices, at least in the American context?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Much about how climate change has evolved to where it is today is about the structural inequities and the systemic roots that we share as communities of color who are disproportionately exploited, dominated, and disproportionately find ourselves being objectified by our political and economic system. Similarly, does our natural resources find ourselves in the same situation in terms of facing extraction and exploitation. And so we find ourselves as frontline communities in a situation where we don't have equal rights under the law. So whether it's the right to clean air, the right to clean water, the right to having the energy that's necessary for life and that is available in abundance, but because of our political, economy being tied to corporate interests, then instead of actually caring about civil rights for people, there is more of a corporatocracy where there's a default to supporting, not just default, but an intent around supporting and protecting corporate interests. And so that plays out in terms of the very things that my co-panels have talked about, the disproportionate exposure to the toxins that are both driving the greenhouse gas emissions that drive climate change, but also harming the environmental health of our communities. That means that we are disproportionately affected as it relates to water scarcity in communities where we're already facing water shutoffs. Then water scarcity is going to intensify that situation. That means that because of everything from historic redlining to modern day ways that development happens, that we are already living in communities that are food insecure, and the shifts in agricultural yields are going to make that much worse. We're already facing housing insecurity in a place where we have millions of acres of land, but yet we don't have the rights to be able to have safe and secure land, and sea level rise is going to be is already displacing people from land, and the ways that that's being addressed are inequitable. So there's really too many connections to name as it relates to the civil rights violations in the climate change continuum. But in terms of how those laws should be used, I mean, the whole notion is again equal rights under our laws, and so we need to make sure that we are going beyond this notion of responsibility only being tied to a very narrow definition of intent. So if the impact is that we are being poisoned and that we have cancer clusters and asthma clusters and all the clusters that are harming us, if the impact is that we are experiencing these extreme weather events and losing our lives because of it, or being driven from our homes and so forth, then we need to be applying the law in a way that actually deals with impact and not just predicate action on intent. So thank you.
Thank you. No, that's, I think what really struck me about what you're saying is, just like the civil rights movement made connections with the larger economic and racial capitalist system, so too does the climate justice movement make those connections, right? And therefore demand accountability on the basis of disproportionate impacts, and not just some thin notion of intent or discriminatory intent. And I think those parallels are really important to make, and are being made by activists and advocates. So thank you for that. And then to Ms. Hamilton, as an ANC commissioner in Southwest DC and longtime neighborhood activist in Buzzard Point, why and how does amplifying the experiences and the stories of residents in the district matter for how we act, we understand, we interpret resilience and climate justice?
That's a great question. It is vitally important to uplift the communities. There are too many communities in this city and throughout the country that are suffering from these environmental injustices, and their voices have been silenced. Oftentimes, they're not invited to the table when the very decisions that are made that directly impact them. It is important that they always be included in the process and not left out or invited to the table when it's too late for them to have an impact. It is just so important to uplift their voices, to make sure that their stories are heard, their lived experiences, what they're dealing with every single day. I think it's just, we have to empower these communities. Oftentimes, when we have meetings, sometimes the community is intimidated. They don't feel welcome. They don't feel encouraged to attend. So I feel like in Buzzard Point, we're dealing with a lot of industrial brownfields, a lot of contaminants. And so what we've been doing is sharing the stories of the residents and what they have endured and what they're going through, letting them use their own voices to tell their stories, not being told through other people. So I think in order to really support and uplift these communities, and in order to work on remedies with them, it is so important that they be in the driving seat that they set the agenda for what is going to happen, and that they have a say as to what the outcomes will be, what things are worked on, and how we can improve their overall quality, health, and well-being within this city. I think we need to give the power back to the people and work with them together collectively to enable things to get better in these neighborhoods.
Thank you so much. And moving us now from Buzzard Point in Southwest to West Harlem, Ms. Miller-Travis, where the organization We Act for Environmental Justice got started, with a very similar approach to centering the stories of people who are being directly affected by toxicity. You've played such a pivotal role in that history. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how those early lessons from a few decades ago in the before time factor into combating climate injustices today, and what have you learned that you think we can all apply today?
It certainly is so very similar to what Rhonda just talked about, that we found ourselves in West Harlem. We lived along the Hudson River, though we didn't really have access to the river. And they determined that they, being the City of New York, US EPA Region 2 and the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, determined that in order to comply with the Clean Water Act, that they needed to build a sewage treatment plant that could treat all the raw sewage and wastewater that was being generated on the west side of Manhattan. And they determined to build that sewage treatment plant along our waterfront, 10 city blocks long, 12 stories high, designed to treat 180 million gallons of raw sewage every day. So, imagine that. Imagine a facility of that size doing that thing. It's an essential function. There's no question about it. It's an essential function. But imagine building something of that magnitude that takes in and processes 180 million gallons of raw sewage a day with not a single odor control device on the facility. Building it and designing it in a way that it would plague the very existence of the 100,000 people who lived in my community, who still live there, across the street from the plant, and telling the people, this is in the 1960s, the early 60s, that it would be a good neighbor. There are so many examples of decisions that were made like that in our community that adversely affected the quality of our lives. And so we decided, myself, Peggy Shepard, the late Chuck Sutton, decided that we really needed to mobilize our neighbors to push back against this. And by the time we got into the fight in the mid 80s, it was too late to stop the construction of the plant, but we wanted to at least shape how the plant impacted our lives. And we fought with the city for decades. We're still fighting with them about it, but we determined that we needed to sue the city of New York and the state of New York for operating that facility as a public and private nuisance to the 100,000 people that lived across the street from it. And we won that lawsuit. And our primary objective was not that we wanted to be remunerated, which as an organization we were, but that we wanted the city to commit the necessary dollars to fixing the fatal flaw in the plant, which was that it didn't have any odor control system. So the city, as a part of the settlement agreement, had to commit 55 million capital dollars to fix the problems that never should have been allowed to be built in the first place. But what we learned from that is that, one, you have to be around the table when the decisions are being made. You have to be in the room when the decisions are being made. And if for any reason you need to get up from that table, you need to tag somebody else in so that there's never a vacant seat. So your community always has 1, 2, as many as necessary voices that are listening, hearing, and being a part of the process. And then you need to get yourself into some position of decision-making authority, not just hearing what other people's designs are for where you live, but being a part of the process of how that design gets envisioned and how it gets implemented. So we learned that at a local level. And I then took those lessons from our community onto working at the Natural Resources Defense Council as the first director of environmental justice there, and trying to lift up what I had learned in our own community for communities around the country, that there was nothing so special about us in Northern Manhattan that was not the same set of lessons, the same set of values, the same set of challenges that communities were facing from one end of this country to the other. Communities of color, low-income communities, tribal communities, immigrant communities, wherever we lived, these problems were besieging our communities. And so it's not just, people may think when they hear this, they may think, oh, wow, that plant probably really smelled awful, but it was odor. It was more than odor. It was odor at a level that transformed our very existence. It was also the adjacent marine transfer station where hundreds of sanitation trucks would idle every day, unleashing particulate pollution across our community as they waited to dump their garbage onto barges that would then take it to the Fresh Kills landfill in another county in New York, in Staten Island. It was the 5 of 7 municipal bus depots also unleashing particulate pollution in the community. It was the Amtrak rail line. It was the New York City subway system that went through the community, and the traffic, 3 highways on 3 sides. It was just ghastly. And when we began to really pull back the covers and peel back this onion to figure out what was going on, we realized that we had a massive crisis with asthma. We realized that we had the highest rate of incidence of asthma in the United States. Our rate of asthma was so high that it drove the national incidence of asthma rate for the United States of America. That's how high the numbers were in our community. Again, this is 100,000 people. We also learned that we had the highest rate of premature death from asthma of any community in the United States. And so we were in crisis, but no one seemed to know that we were in crisis. But somebody must have known, because in New York State, and Adrian can correct me if I'm wrong, I think it's true in every state, when a person dies, you have to register what that person died from. Every state has to do this. Every state health department has to do this. So people knew in New York State that there was a crisis underway in our community, but no one ever connected the dots. No one ever said, we need to look at what's going on there. We need to figure it out. We had to do that for ourselves. We had to train ourselves. We had to teach ourselves. We had to become environmentalists overnight. We had to become environmental scientists. I decided to become a land use planner because the land use planning process was victimizing us over and over and over again. But we did teach ourselves those things. We did become expert at it. Peggy Shepard and I, at an undergraduate level, neither one of us studied anything that had to do with environment. Peggy was a journalism major and a journalist, and I was a political science major and a researcher. And we never stepped foot in an environmental class. But once we realized that our community was literally dying, we had to teach ourselves. And so for the longest time, Malini, if you were to say my name in New York, someone would say the North River Sewage Treatment Plant. Right. So for the longest time, I was associated with the sewage treatment plant. And when I moved here to the DMV, I said, I need to get a new freaking identity, one that does not include a sewage treatment plant. But it wasn't just that I was associated with it. It was that I knew everything about how that plant worked. I knew everything about sanitary sewage systems. I knew everything about the application of the Clean Water Act. I had to teach myself those things. And so I took that lesson from West Harlem and applied it to communities across the United States, that it's not true that you have to have some specialized space in your brain to know these issues. But if you are under threat, you will learn whatever you need to learn.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing that story. And all of you, I think what I appreciate so much about this conversation is just the specificity with which you're talking, right, about the experiences. And I think the learning here, right, is just to keep pushing and to use the resources at hand, but that people can do this, and you don't have to have a specialized training. And I really appreciated hearing about the story of the sanitation plant. Going into more specifics, Dr. Hollis recently, a New York Times article reported that because US cities are so racially segregated, and we've heard about that. We've heard about the redlining and the legacies of intentionally planned segregated neighborhoods. And because they're so segregated, it turns out that heat waves are really death-blowing and destructive for communities of color that don't have ways to alleviate vulnerability to heat waves. So just thinking about that specific example, right, of heat waves and neighborhood racial segregation, right? How do you think we can address the confluence or intersectionality of those issues going forward? Because heat waves are going to get worse with climate change.
Yeah, heat waves are definitely getting worse now, and we have to make some changes. And I was talking to Vernice about this and said you might have to go back into business as a urban planner, because we need to go back and change some things. What you're talking about, of course, is the urban heat island effect in particular, and also the fact that communities don't have access to green space. I mean, let's call it what it is. There are no parks, there are weeds, but that's because, there are vacant areas that the city has that they could turn into usable areas. But for whatever reason, that hasn't been the option. There are certain things that people can do on a smaller level. And I get excited about this topic, so I'm trying to maintain my composure here. But, something as simple as adapting the roof of building, especially in public housing, from black to white. Changing the color makes it cooler. How about something as simple as in the future, making sure that people have access to green space? I mean, where I live now in Prince George's County, I notice we're becoming gentrified. And as we do that, there are bike lanes that are being put in place. There are extra trees that are being planted. There are green spaces that are being developed. Let's not just do that when places are gentrified, when Black people and people of color in general are being moved out, right? And that other people are being moved in. And then you want to make it comfortable and safe and lower the temperature. How about doing it for people who live there now, right? And so in addition to that, something as simple as looking at renewable energy, right? Because what I hear from a lot of people that I work with, a lot of community partners, is that they feel like they're cooling the outside because of infrastructure issues and issues around the fact that, they have to keep their doors and windows open in some instances to maintain a certain level of livability when it comes to temperature. So there are a lot of changes we can do, and we need to stop just looking at mitigation, like what are we going to do after the fact? But let's talk about making some, addressing areas in adaptation. What can we do now? And I think that's the question you're asking. And some of this is very simple. When it comes to public housing in general, which isn't, that isn't the majority of the issue, but even with public housing, that should be an easy lift, because that is government sponsored. And we need to be thinking of ways with community input. That's the first important fact, is that as equal stakeholders, you need to bring in everybody who's going to be affected. And that includes communities, because as they like to say, if we're not around the table, we're on the menu. And that is so true, right? Because who knows better than someone who's living this, what they need in order to not only survive, but thrive in an environment that has been created because of racism to not be conducive to a healthy and safe life, right? So, those are just some of the things. I could go on, but I'll stop now.
No, absolutely. No, I think that kind of pragmatic steps that should be taken, because they're fairly low-hanging fruit. I mean, there is no excuse for not taking them, and I think that's the point you're trying to make. And that's where we keep coming up against structural racism and lack of accountability. Jackie, ever since you said the word corporatocracy, it's been ringing in my head, and I just think that what you're doing in speaking truth to power is exactly what we need. And so I was wondering, as someone who has been working on civil rights and economic rights, can you give some examples of how political accountability matters for environmental justice?
Yes, thank you so much. So as we know, we're in an election season, and so this is a time when there's this kind of rush for civic engagement, and the fact is we need to be civically engaged all year round, every year, not just during this time, because there are so many decisions that are being made on a daily basis that impact us, and yet too often we're not even represented at as Adrian said, at those tables. And too often there are other influences that are just driving the decisions that are being made. So we put out this report a couple of years ago called Fossil Fueled Foolery, where we really laid out all the ways that some of these large corporations and industries are influencing our political system, from everything from directly funding campaigns for folks who will then be beholden to those interests, to paying into groups like ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, that pushes everything from voter suppression laws to prison privatization, to school privatization, to water privatization, and everything in between. And so, they're putting a lot of money behind it and a lot of paid lobbyists to do so. And so one of the things that we really need to be thinking about in terms of government accountability is getting money out of politics, campaign finance reform, and reversing Citizens United, which gives corporations the same level of rights as people have rights. And so we need to make those kind of core structural changes, and then we need to be holding our elected officials accountable in a very strong way, so that when we see them veering down that path of being accountable to corporate interests, that we reel them back with the power of the people. So that's critical as well. So
yeah, thank you. Thank
Sure.
you so much. Continuing on the topic of political accountability, to Rhonda, voters across America have either voted early or are going to the polls in a few days. What are your hopes and expectations for how some of these topics that we've been discussing, right? Structural racism, environmental justice, accountability and corruption, right? Money in politics. What are your hopes for how some of these topics will feature on voters' minds, and what would you want them to know?
We all know that these concerns are at the forefront of a lot of minds of the voters as they're going down to cast their ballots. They're thinking about these communities that have been devastated, that have been left out of the process, that are blatantly ignored on every level. Communities are just disregarded and tossed to the side. And I know that the voters see that. We've all witnessed that. We've all experienced that with our own eyes, how little regards for so many communities. It's just, a lot of it's just obvious, just not caring about the rights of people, the rights of individuals, the rights of people to live in healthy and safe environments, to not feel threatened in their own environments. And I feel that when we go down to cast our ballots, as these concerns are on our minds, as we're deciding who we vote for and support, we need to make sure that these concerns are at the top of the agenda for every elected official, that they know that we will not let them forget about these concerns, that we would continue to hold them accountable, to push them, to make sure that we are included, and to make sure that as they're voting on policies, as they're putting initiatives forward, that we're going to make sure that these communities are included in those, and that their concerns are properly addressed, and they do their very best to make sure that we're given the supports and resources that we are needed. So I feel that accountability is just critically important, and that we need to keep talking to, writing, email, and letting our elected officials know that we're here for the long run, and we're going to continue to support these communities.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. I'm going to ask Vernice one more question, and then we're actually going to turn it over to the Q&A, because the audience is really chiming in and wanting to ask some questions. So Vernice, I'll give you the final question from me, which is, why do you refer to this period as a syndemic? What is that, and how does it apply in the context of climate justice?
So I stumbled across this word in, I want to say it was March, and I was highly exorcised by the fact that once we began to get disaggregated data from the Centers for Disease Control, excuse the traffic in the back, I'm outside, and it was a battle to get that disaggregated data out of the Centers for Disease Control about how COVID was affecting various populations in the United States. And the first thing that I saw once that first bit of data eked out of CDC was that African Americans had a much higher incidence of COVID and a much higher rate of death from COVID. And then on top of that, the county that we live in, we being Dr. Hollis and I, a whole bunch of people live here who are in the environmental justice space and who work at US EPA. We all seem to live in the same town in Bowie, Maryland, or Upper Marlboro, which is our adjacent town. That we were the COVID epicenter in the state of Maryland. And to this moment, I cannot figure out why that is, because we have none of the, except that we're African American or of African descent, we have none of the other markers that folks are saying makes populations more vulnerable. So I'm searching and searching and searching and trying to figure out, there's something here, there's something amiss, but there's something that connects all of this and I can't put my finger on it. And I stumbled upon this word syndemic. And the concept of syndemic comes from the field of public health, but particularly folks who are working in the HIV/AIDS epidemic. And what they talked about then in the early 90s, when this word was first articulated, is that many populations, but particularly people of color who were impacted by the HIV/AIDS pandemic, were impacted by multiple pandemics at once, right? So HIV/AIDS, systemic racism, and other health disparities. And immediately I drew from that and I said, oh my God, we have been talking about this for decades in the environmental justice space. We called it multiple and synergistic effects. And we kept asking US EPA and every other federal agency, isn't it a completely different reality when you live in a place that you are exposed to multiple sources of pollution from multiple emitters, you're experiencing virulent racism on a daily basis, you have pre-existing health disparities and or lack of health infrastructure? Doesn't that mean that you have a completely different reality, and our existing environmental regulatory system is not designed to address what happens to people who live in those circumstances? So a syndemic is when you have more than two pandemics or massive health impacts that impact the same geographic population, right? So, and Adrian was the first person that I called to tell about this. I said, oh my God, I've been looking for this word for decades. And I finally have found a word that explains so intimately what it is that we've always been up against. And right now, the COVID or coronavirus pandemic is just the latest layer on top of a set of structural issues that have been targeting the same populations over and over and over and over for generations, for, you know, in the case of indigenous people, for millennia. And what we see happening to these communities in terms of the vulnerability to COVID is a vulnerability that has existed forever. And the challenge is, do we look at this in an isolated fashion, or do we look at this as integrated and intersectional with so many other issues? We also have seen the Harvard School of Public Health researchers in China, researchers in Italy have said that COVID is actually moving through the air as it attaches itself to fine particles, fine particle pollution. So then it stands to reason that people who live in places that have higher levels of exposure to fine particle pollution, like the community that I'm from in New York, like Baltimore City, like Detroit, like so many other places across this country, one of the reasons that we see these elevated levels of COVID and death from COVID is because we already had environmental conditions that made us especially vulnerable. And it's important for people to understand, everybody who's working in this space, everybody who's trying to fight this disproportionate impact of COVID in communities of color, what makes us so vulnerable are the pre-existing environmental threats that we were already living with. And so you really have to address those underlying environmental threats. You have to address systemic and institutional racism. You have to address that all at once as you're also trying to address COVID, because it's the intermingling of those things that are making us so vulnerable. So that's what a syndemic is. And I make my colleagues crazy because I use it all the time. I use it in a sentence, I use it in a paragraph, I use it all the time, because I want people to know that this is what people in the EJ movement have been talking about forever. We didn't know this word because it was in another public health space. But this is the word that we've been trying to formalize and trying to get people to understand. It's not just air pollution. It's air pollution, racism, lack of health infrastructure, and so many other things that are making us vulnerable. Even when COVID goes away, even when there's a vaccine, even when we can raise the level of trust so that people of color will be able to take advantage of that safe vaccine once it's developed, we're still going to have these other systemic issues, and we're still going to be vulnerable. We just won't have COVID, but we'll have all these other things. And as the NAACP has been saying for the longest time, they were talking about racist violence. I think it's true for everything. We're sick of dying. We are sick of dying.
Thank you so much. I think that's an incredibly powerful word. And sometimes what you need is a narrative change. Sometimes what you need is a label, right, to shift the conversation. And so this might just well be one of those words that captures the historical intersectionalities of exactly what you're talking about. Mm-hmm. So we have several questions, and I'm going to pick out a few. Maybe we'll start with perhaps a more personal question that comes from one of our audience members who asks, I would like to know how you ladies feel about being women of color in a mostly white field of work. So maybe Adrian, we'll start with you.
Excuse me.
Yes, I knew you were going to start with me. You know what? That is, it's a challenge. It is. It's always been a challenge. But if you look at the environmental justice movement, you see that while we do have a lot of male spearheading different organizations, I think it would be fair to say the majority of those who lead are women, and they've been fighting for things that I benefit from. And one of those things is having a seat at the table. And that is one of the things that I constantly push for in all the different spaces and try to make everybody else understand. Every day there's a battle. There's some kind of battle, and we talk about it. And I think part of the beauty is having this support system. I'm either texting Jackie or calling Bernice or Leslie or whoever else, that works in this space with me. And we talk about the challenges we face and the importance of that in being in this space is that you're going to be challenged, because there are still folks who believe that there is no correlation between racism and what's going on, and that COVID doesn't strike anybody of people of color differently. Beside the fact that this happened in the 1700s and again in the early 1900s. So sometimes it's frustrating and it makes you angry. Other times, yes, it makes you sad and you get upset and a little, depressed. And then you talk to somebody who's experienced something similar, either recently or in the past, and you get that perspective. And it makes you more determined, I think, to do this work and to succeed at it and to demand. And what I learned from both the men and the women in this space is that you've got to keep talking, and you've got to have that voice, and you've got to be demanding, and you've got to make sure that when you wherever you are, you're putting communities first, and you're giving them making sure that they have the opportunity to be heard. And so I guess that, I don't know if that answers the question, but it's got me riled up. So I guess it does in a way. So I'll step back and let someone else speak.
Can I invite one of the other three panelists to offer thoughts?
Looks like Bernice is on mute, but she's talking.
I would just add a dour note to that answer, which is that the deputy director of We Act for Environmental Justice, who worked for our organization for 26 years, it was the second job he ever had, Cecil Corbin Mart, passed away on late Thursday night into Friday morning. He had a massive aneurysm and stroke on Tuesday. And I wish I could say that Cecil is my only friend, dear, close personal friend in the EJ movement, who died before their time. He was 51 years old, but he's not my only friend. I have lost so many people who mattered so very, very, very much to me. I mean, you know, the people I hung out with, the people I went on vacation with, the people I traveled the world with, the people I built this movement with, so many of them are gone. Dana Alston died at 48. Damu Smith died at 53. Gene Sindab, also 51 years old. And we could spend the rest of this time with me just calling the names of people who died before their time. Gene Gowna from the Southwest Organizing Project in Albuquerque, New Mexico. So many people. People don't seem to get to live to be ripe old ages and die of natural causes because we work so hard. And many of us live in the circumstances that we're also fighting against, and we're fighting racism on a daily basis. And so I raise that to say that I love what I do. I love that I get to share this space with so many wonderful people, like all the women that are on this panel, but I worry about us each and every day. And so when I worked at the Ford Foundation as a program officer at the Ford Foundation, I gave a grant to a place called Vallecitos Mountain Refuge, which was a Buddhist retreat center in the Carson National Forest in New Mexico. I had been there in a time of great difficulty in my own career. Great difficulty meaning I wanted to kill up a bunch of white people that I worked with, and I'll just leave it at that. And I went to this retreat center, and I went because my girlfriend Jean Sindab had been trying to get me to go, and I didn't want to go someplace that didn't have any electricity or indoor plumbing. And so I went in response to Jean's death, and it changed my life. It changed my life, and it definitely made me so much stronger internally and so much stronger professionally. It just changed my life, and it was an extraordinary experience. And so it did so much for me that I gave them a grant to build a series of retreats, leadership retreats for environmental justice folks. And a lot of people went, and everybody who went wrote me back and said they had the same life-changing experience. But the very people on the front lines that I really needed to go could not find their way there, including, I'm calling out my friends in New Mexico. They were in New Mexico and they couldn't get themselves to this retreat because they were so busy. And what they were doing was so important. And it was, you know, they just couldn't be away from a phone, blah, blah, blah. Yes, you can. And if you don't do it, you may not be here for the long haul. And so, you know, we hear people say this all the time and we think it's trite. You know, this is a marathon. It's not a short distance race. Well, in order to be here for the marathon, you have to make sure that you yourself are healthy and whole. And we don't always do that. And so I just want to say in memory of Cecil, I don't think I can absorb one more person leaving here before their time. I really don't think I can. And so I need all of the people who are in this movement to stop and take better care of ourselves.
Thanks so much, Bernice. Yeah, this is difficult work. Thank you for sharing that. Jackie, I wonder if you could weigh in on a question we've gotten from the audience, making connections between environmental justice and conversations going on in the country about prisons and policing, and the fact, that this is obviously, related in the sense that it is part of the systems that we're talking about that have perpetuated oppression. But are there ways that you've thought about these connections between, the Black Lives Matter movement, for instance, and environmental justice?
Yeah, well, okay, yeah. So, so for one thing, we're actually working on this 3-part report and campaign called basically, well, the tagline is Race, Environmental Justice, and the School to Prison Industrial Complex Continuum. And it's the 3 parts are starting with looking at the school to prison pipeline in particular, and the ways that environmental injustices are directly tied to the school to prison pipeline, whether it is the fact that if you're not on grade level by the 3rd grade, you're more likely to enter into the school to prison pipeline. And when we have African-American children with 3 to 5 times more likely to enter the hospital from an asthma attack, 2 to 3 times more likely to die of asthma, and therefore also having many days out of school and poor air quality days due to asthma. We know that the coal-fired power plants and oil refineries and incinerators are all pumping, and near roadway air pollution are all pumping the types of toxins that are getting into kids' lungs that are resulting in that, as well as toxins including manganese and lead, which are tied to behavior issues, as well as attention deficit disorder, which again impacts. And then we also know that African-American family making $50,000 a year is more likely to live next to a toxic facility than a white American family making $15,000 a year. And that if you're living next to a toxic facility, on average, your property values are 15% lower. And we know the property values tied directly into financing for school. So school quality is impacted by this. And so when you have all of these, and then on top of it, differential access to food security, 26% of African-American families are food insecure. And so if you're not also getting the proper nutrients, your ability to be able to thrive in school is a challenge. So we talk about how, all of those combine to make it harder for kids to be able to be on grade level by the 3rd grade. And then we also know that in our schools that too often the school discipline issues and so forth then also lead to this atmosphere that also kind of feeds the school to prison pipeline. We also know how much money there is to be made from people who are inmates. When we were, one of the things that actually started us, we were actually just going to do a paper on inmate labor and disasters, because we were looking at this whole issue of inmates being used to fight fires and so forth. And when I say used, I'm using that language intentionally, because once again, just like, we're cargo brought into this country and enslaved for years, in similar ways that the ways that prisoners are being commodified. They're actually listed on county budgets, like tractor trailers, desks, inmates, and then there's like a dollar sign next to, in terms of inventory, based on what labor they'll be able to give to any situation. And so we see, and when we talked about the fires and on the news, I was watching on CNN, they were talking about the forest fires and saying that because of the prisoners having early release with COVID-19, there are fewer resources to fight the fires. And so again, referring to people as resources, again, is that objectification and commoditization of people. And not to mention how, again, school privatization is one of the things that are fought for by groups like ALEC that are also pushing against clean air and clean water, and pushing for water privatization. So the direct intersections between environmental justice and criminal justice are just so very many. Yes.
Yeah, that was phenomenal in terms of the way you connected those dots through, to different threads, but all of which obviously relate to that sort of insidious connection.
And I will say too, just as a final thing, yes, on your last question about the Black Lives Matter movement, is that now there is a movement, a collaboration between environmental justice and the movement for Black Lives, and called the Red, Black, and Green New Deal, where these groups are coming together and recognizing these intersections and putting together a comprehensive policy agenda that even goes beyond what folks already thought was too big of a scope for the Green New Deal, but recognizing that these connections, these rights, when we talk about inalienable rights in the Declaration of Human Rights, it's true that they are inalienable. They're inextricably interconnected. So it's a comprehensive policy agenda. That's a suite of policies that might not necessarily be all in one, but definitely necessary in order for us to advance true justice. So I just wanted to leave it there in terms of that connection between EJ and the movement for Black Lives.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. And I think we'll all be looking that up and following that closely. We're almost at time, and this conversation has gone by so quickly. And I just want to, recognize that many student leaders, especially Black and Brown student leaders, are listening in on this conversation. And I was wondering if you could leave them, as well as white accomplices, with some final thoughts on what young people today can do to fight and to be in this movement and to stay the course without injuring themselves, as you were talking about earlier, Bernice. And so, any sort of final thoughts on how young people can rally? And I know they already are, but maybe we'll start with you, Rhonda.
I would say don't be afraid to speak up. You have the power. You can email, you can text, you can write. There's so many ways that you can contribute and help with these issues and these concerns. The concerns that you've heard today, join organizations, advocate for communities, but don't be afraid to be a part of the process, and don't feel like you have to be an environmental expert or expert on any of these concerns. You can help, and it's little ways that you can help, but just, be willing to ask someone, how I can help, and don't be afraid, and don't feel like your help that you're contributing doesn't matter, because it does. The help that you provide can help these communities, and knowing that somebody cares is just super important. So continue to be a part of these communities and reach out to people that are in them.
Adrian?
I must have looked like I wanted to say something. I do. I just want to say, young people bring such a fresh burst of energy to this movement, to this moment, recognizing, of course, as we've been talking about, the fact that this is historical and that people have been fighting and struggling for years to get, just to get the attention that it's gotten. I think that the beauty of this relationship, the beauty of what can be and what is occurring, is that these fresh new ideas and this fresh burst of energy, combined with the historical knowledge and experience of people who've been doing this for so long, is just invaluable. And so so I agree with what Rhonda said, and find an organization in your community, because there is one. I'm more than sure that there is 1, 2, 3, or 4, and if there isn't, start one, right? We've seen that work. And as Rhonda also said, use your voice, because that is the most important tool that you have. And when you're doing that, keep in mind that we're all learning from each other. We're all open to new ways of doing things, and you have to be open to that, and we have to be open to that, and open to ways to work together. There are different populations that are more willing to listen to young people, are more willing to listen to people who've been doing this for 40 years and have more experience. And all of those populations need the same information and need to be part of this big general discussion. So I'm all about partnership and working together as equal stakeholders in this. So thank you.
Thank you. Jackie?
Yes, sorry. There are so many, as both Rhonda and Adrian said, there's so many avenues that youth can engage to be involved, whether it's the Sunrise Movement, the Power Shift Network, the NAACP Youth and College Division, all these different ways that the folks are getting involved. And then, as was also said, just doing whatever you can. If there's not, and also when you talk about white allies as well, showing up for racial justice is another great group that folks can get involved in. And then starting our own thing right here in Baltimore, we had the Free Your Voice folks who really started and were successful, youth-led movement that were successful in stopping the building of what would have been one of the largest incinerators in the nation, right in their backyard. And so they used everything from developing video to community education and mobilization to advocating at their zoning boards to affect change. So whether it's writing an op-ed or doing a TikTok video or joining a group or starting your own group, there's so many ways that youth can get involved. So, and again, welcome to the NAACP if you'd like to join us. Thank you.
Bernice? And you're mute.
So I think we've seen some of the most extraordinary youth-powered movement in the movement for Black Lives and Black Lives Matter. And it was young people, who really pushed the movement to the level that it's at now. And in so doing, created so much space for so many of the rest of us who've been working on so many other issues for so long, but all kinds of doors are opening and conversations are being had and people are rethinking ways that they've been doing business or, addressing issues for the longest time, because you created that space. You did that. And while, you know, those of us who are older were told to stay inside and stay on lockdown because we were particularly vulnerable, you went out there and put your lives on the line during the height of the first round of COVID. And you were out there every single day, every night, day in, day out. The police came for you. And while I'm speaking about the police, just want to highlight that today, the mayor of DC is moving $43 million of funds in DC to pay for the overtime expenses of the Metro Police Department in DC, who did what? Beat up on Black people and white folks and their allies who were out there demanding space and demanding an end to police brutality. So, you know, all your skin folk ain't your kinfolk, remember that. But also remember that you have already shown the nation how powerful you are. You have shown us all something. And I salute you. And, you know, we got to walk through this door together because, you know, the door ain't going to stay open forever. Right now, you know, anti-racism and fighting racism is something that everybody's talking about. It's not going to stay like that forever. But you opened that door. You kicked it in. And I'm so very proud of you, and just keep doing that. And we just all need to link up arms and man those barricades together to make the kind of transformational change that we know this society needs to have. But I've not seen anything like the movement for Black Lives, I think, in my entire life. I've not seen anything as powerful as the movement for Black Lives.
Well, thank you so much to our panelists. And I just want all the audience members and the panelists to know that I've saved all the questions because they're really, really good. And I will be sending them to the speakers, food for thought to them. I like to do that at the end of these Zoom sessions because I think each of you, including the audience members, bring something to the table. So thank you so much. Your words have been wings for all of us. We're so grateful to you for your time, for your insight, for your wisdom. For all of you, please stay tuned for more programming by SIS and the Anti-Racism Center.